I'm a medical doctor and a member at large of an FDA advisory committee for a new drug that's still going through trials, known as Omphernal. A few weeks ago, I was checking my email when I saw a message from a colleague. I was very disturbed after reading the email, and I hope you see why. I've attached the email below. Dear Dr. Pierce, as you requested, what follows is the full, unabridged account of the incident that had occurred at Pulaski Hospital Center during the Phase 3 trials of Omphernal. The case concerns patient number 2365786, hereafter known pseudonymously as Mr. John Wade. My name is Dr. Evelyn Shadow, MD, a clinical psychiatrist and principal investigator during the section of the study involving Mr. Wade. I'm no longer affiliated with NeuroCorp, as I resigned immediately following the incident that I'm about to detail. Mr. Wade is a 43-year-old white male who suffers from paranoid schizophrenia ever since he was 17 years old. Mr. Wade suffers from classical positive symptoms of paranoid schizophrenia, including extremely vivid auditory and visual hallucinations. Since his diagnosis, he's had over a dozen major hospitalizations and several overdoses. He has been on numerous major antipsychotics including thioridazine and chlorpromazine, but none seem to have even a minor effect on his hallucinations. For over a year before his admission to the Pulaski Hospital Center, a maximum security forensic psychiatric facility. Before his admission, Wade had worked on and off at his brother's lawn care business as an office aide. However, his employment came to an abrupt halt when he allegedly doused a fellow employee in gasoline before lighting the man on fire and sitting there while the victim burned. The man died at the scene of his wounds, and Mr. Wade was committed to Pulaski to await his evaluation to find out if he was fit to stand trial for first-degree murder. According to Mr. Wade's brother, he had not been taking his medication for over a year. We approached Mr. Wade and his brother about an experimental treatment using a novel antipsychotic, Omphernal. The drug at the time was still in the testing phases developed by NeuroCorp, a pharmaceutical industrial concern specializing in innovative treatments for mental illnesses. In phases 1 and 2, studies were conducted in Barbados. Omphernal showed promising improvements in individuals with schizophrenia, whose symptoms failed to be treated with other antipsychotics. Mr. Wade agreed to participate in the double-blind study, and we scheduled him for an intake interview with our team of mental health professionals. There in the small, sterile interrogation room, he sat in a straitjacket as we began to record. We asked him to describe what he saw and heard. He reported that he would constantly hear a high-pitched, collective screaming, like a burning bus full of children, sometimes of something else. When we asked him to elaborate, he was terse except to say, "The Watchers." He reports that these screams would persist day and night. Sometimes, Mr. Wade reported seeing visual hallucinations of the entities that he referred to as the Watchers. When asked repeatedly to detail what exactly he meant by that, Mr. Wade simply repeated cryptically, as if my recitation. His works were with the Watchers, and with the Holy Ones were his days. When asked why he had doused the man in gasoline, he smiled. "Rejoice. The man was wicked, and the Watchers did instruct me to smite him for his sins. For his sins were great and perverted the innocents." We also interviewed his brother, Frank, his only living relative. "John and I, our parents were addicts in Boston, and they practically abandoned us on the street when we were both really young, and we were taken up by this boys' home, St. Eusebius. It was tough growing up in that home. The sisters were strict and sometimes sadistic. and they constantly would force us to recite passages from the Bible since we were like 5 years old. If we got one word wrong, it was a smack to the cheek with a wooden paddle. And those nuns could give Ted Williams a run for his money, if you know what I mean. However, John was special. He did really well on those recitations, and he impressed the sisters when he could commit the entire book of Isaiah to memory, just in a week. Frank had brought John's Bible from the orphanage, a shabby Gideon International that had stained pages. This was John's most valued possession in the world. He asked me to bring it to him in prison. He flipped through the pages, and we could see drawings and writings feverishly scrawled into the margins. When we opened to the book of Ezekiel, the entire page was darkened with so much ink scribbling, page after page, that you could barely make out the text. Oh yeah, Ezekiel was his favorite for some reason. He would spend all of his free time day and night, reading the same passage over and over, even into adulthood. We then asked Frank to describe to us when John began to experience symptoms. When John turned 17, he suddenly dropped out of school. He was a wicked smart kid, even if he was a bit of the social outcast type. However, one day he just suddenly didn't show up to class. By then, I was already out of school and starting a job in New Haven, and I had gotten a call from the school. John hadn't showed up in over 2 weeks, and the school was concerned that he was truant. I drove over back to Boston to the apartment that I helped him pay for, and he wouldn't answer the door. I had an extra key, so I was still able to get in. I called his name over and over, and there was no answer. When I reached his room, I noticed that it was locked. I could smell something foul, and I feared for the worst. I busted in the door and I saw him standing there naked. In the corner was where he went to the bathroom. That was what I had smelled. And then I looked around the room, and everything, the walls, the ceilings, the floors, was scrawled in what appeared to be blood. His blood, I later found out. He had been collecting it in bowls and then painting these weird, bizarre symbols with circles and other shapes in them, all over the room. I was so scared. "John," I remember saying. "John, what the heck?" He turned around, and I remember seeing that he was smiling in his eyes, and his eyes were so big. He told me that he had been hearing voices in his head. They told him that they came from above, and they told him the secrets of the universe or something. Anyways, that's when I knew I had to call the police. They strapped him to a gurney and took him away to Massachusetts State for several months. He came out and he was normal for a while, but then he stopped taking his medication. When I asked him why, he told me that it quieted the voices so he couldn't hear. I told him that was the whole point, to not hear voices because that wasn't normal. And thus the cycle began. He would take his medication, be relatively normal for several months, stop taking it, start hearing the voices again that tell him to do some pretty terrible stuff, and then back to the hospital. And tell me about the incident involving the client at your lawn care business. Frank took a minute and stared deeply into midair. He continued. "Well," he cleared his throat, looking uneasy. "You see, with his condition, John couldn't keep a job for more than a few weeks. He's my brother, so I had to take him under my wing at my lawn care business. Sean was good with the paperwork, so that's what he did. One day, one of our hedge trimmers, Kyle, came in. John didn't know Kyle, and that was the first day that they had met. I was at my office when I suddenly had heard screaming. I ran into the front of the shop, and I saw that Kyle was on the floor, burning and writhing and screaming. It was horrible. I noticed that John was standing there, smiling with a container of gasoline in his hand. I screamed at him, "What the heck did you do?" He later told the police that some voice in his head told him that Kyle was impure or something, that he did stuff to kids, and that he needed to be purified. I'm telling you, my brother's not alright in the head. What was weird though was that I was watching the news coverage about John killing Kyle later in the day, and the media had discovered that what my brother had said about Kyle was true. He had been doing it for years in the trailer park. We started Mr. Wade initially on 50 milligrams of the treatment, twice a day orally starting on June 3rd. After a month of gradual improvement, we decided to increase the dosage to 100 milligrams. Mr. Wade showed an impressive, almost immediate improvement in his positive and negative symptoms, with a startling 80% improvement on the positive and negative symptom scale. On the clinical Global Impression Schizophrenia, which rates schizophrenia from least severe at 1 to most severe at 7, Mr. Wade had scored a 7 on June 3rd and a 2 on July 2nd. Additionally, Mr. Wade's blood dopamine levels increased dramatically almost as soon as we had administered the treatment. Mr. Wade's hallucinations, what he had called visions, persisted, but he reported that the screaming had stopped. When we asked him what he heard now, he responded, "Singing. I hear singing, not screaming." There was also a noticeable increase in the religiosity of Mr. Wade. He would spend almost all hours of the day reading his Bible and he appeared to pray. I conducted weekly mental health evaluations to track his progress. Mr. Wade continued to make significant neurophysiological improvements while on the treatment regimen. However, Mr. Wade continued to talk about his visions involving the Watchers. During one interview, I inquired about his visions. "What do you mean by Watchers, John?" John smiled cryptically. "They're here." "What do you mean by that, John?" Mr. Wade sat in his chair confined by the straitjacket, and he raised his head. He was looking in my direction but did not look me in the eye. It was like he was staring through me. No, behind me. "Do you not see it? There's one standing right behind you." I instinctively turned around. Nothing. "How often do you see these Watchers?" "All the time, they follow me." Despite all of his improvements, Mr. Wade's auditory and visual hallucinations continued. While hospitalized, we encouraged Mr. Wade to take up painting as a relaxing activity, but it also provided us a qualitative analysis of his mental well-being. His paintings were interesting to say the least. The hospital had an old television set with some Bob Ross VHS tapes. We supplied Mr. Wade with the supplies, including oil paint, brushes, canvases, and linseed oil, and left him alone in the room with the guard outside for him to unwind and paint. An hour later, we came back into the room. "John, I believe you've been working on some pretty pictures for us." "Yes, Dr. Shoto," John said, grinning. He turned the canvas around. "Jesus Christ," the guard behind me let out. It took me a moment to register what he had painted. "What is that, John?" John paused, tilting his head in confusion, his smile turning into a frown. "What? You don't like it, Dr. Shoto?" John, maybe we can call it a day." After John was ushered back into his room by the guard, I picked up the canvas. On the canvas, Mr. Wade had painted what I can only describe as these bizarre beings, with circular bodies covered with numerous wings and eyes, like some eldritch, nightmarish abomination. Father Culkin was the hospital chaplain, an old man in his 80s who ministers to the religious needs of the patients at Pulaski. Father Culkin also held weekly mass services to Catholic patients, and Mr. Wade was known to regularly attend. A week after our last evaluation, Mr. Wade attended mass. It started as a routine mass service. There was only one other person in the room, A fellow patient, as the guard, being an observant Jew, chose to remain outside of the chapel. As Father Culkin's back was turned to the room in the blessing of the bread and wine, Mr. Wade quietly got up from the pew and walked towards Father Culkin. According to the witness, Mr. Wade began to take out a metal container hidden in his hospital robes. We later found at the scene that this was a container of the linseed oil that Mr. Wade had smuggled from his painting session. In one swift motion, even before Father Culkin could realize what was about to occur, Mr. Wade splashed the entire container of linseed oil on the priest, grabbed the candle at the altar and set the priest on fire. Father Culkin fully combusted in less than a second. The witness reported Father Culkin screaming in pain for a few seconds before his body collapsed to the ground, still burning. The guard heard the commotion and rushed in, but it was far too late. When the fire and paramedics arrived, Father Culkin had expired at the scene. Wade was promptly sedated, straitjacketed, and sent to his room. I remember arriving at the chapel, seeing the black char marks where Father Culkin's body had been, and thinking, how could a human being do this? I later questioned Mr. Wade about this. Why did you kill Father Culkin? He slowly smiled. In a calm voice, he responded, slowly sounding out his words syllable by syllable. Father Culkin was wicked. The Watchers told me to do it, to purify him of his sins. He needed it to be made pure through fire. What sins are you talking about? His laptop, Dr. Shoto. The Watchers know about what the Father sees and does. They saw him. They illuminated him. His actions are impure. He was so bright when he did Mass. He was practically shining, burning. He began to quietly cackle to himself before continuing. I served the Watchers, and they commanded me to purify him. Rejoice with him, O heavens. Bow down to him. O gods, for he avenges the blood of his children and takes vengeance on his adversaries. Later that night, as I finished some emails, I decided to do a bit of research on fire, particularly the religious meaning behind it, given Mr. Wade's inclinations. I wasn't raised religious growing up, so religion was not a strong suit. Admittedly, I was fascinated by what I found. Evidently, fire as a symbol of purity is present in almost every major religion. In Zoroastrianism, the ancient faith of the Persians, fire was revered as a symbol of truth and purity, as fire cannot be polluted. In Hinduism, fire is used in various religious rituals as a mediator between humans and gods. The ancient Romans had a sacred fire dedicated to the goddess Vesta, with the chaste versions tending to it to prevent the hearth from going out. In the Hebrew Bible, God often spoke through fire, first in a burning bush and then in a pillar of fire. Fire was used as a symbol of purity, but also divine wrath. Fire was described as coming out of the presence of the Lord, which consumed those that invoked divine judgment. Sodom and Gomorrah were consumed by fire and brimstone. In the New Testament, Christ is said to arrive to baptize by the Holy Spirit in fire, and in the book of Hebrews, God is described as a consuming fire. And then I realized it. Whatever Mr. Wade sees in his visions, he views fire as a vehicle of purity. Somehow, in the voices in his head, and the figures in his visions, they tell him that his two victims were impure, perhaps having committed transgressions of some kind. In this developing pyromania, Mr. Wade thought that he was helping them by lighting them on fire to purify them. I understood why Mr. Wade thought lighting Kyle on fire was logical in his twisted mental calculus, but why did he kill an old priest? Suddenly, I received a message. A colleague of mine had notified me that the police had uncovered 50 gigabytes of inappropriate information in Father Culkin's laptop. There were dozens of reports of bad things happening by Culkin in parishes that he administered to previously in Boston, and he was transferred to the hospital after the fact by the Archdiocese. The question lingered in my psyche to this day. How did Mr. Wade know about Father Culkin? A week later, as I was getting to evaluate Mr. Wade, the guard took me aside at the door and let me know that he's been hearing things coming from Mr. Wade's room late at night. He's been just facing the corner of the room, chanting and bowing. It's disturbing. I don't know, but some of the words sound like what they taught us to recite in the Kiddush in Hebrew school. I don't know how, but I think he knows Hebrew. Hebrew? What do you think he was saying? The guard chuckled. I'm not fluent. We only learned what we needed to say the prayers, and it's like the prayers that he's saying are almost similar. Mr. Wade isn't Jewish, is he? He doesn't indicate it on his file. Oh, definitely not. I don't know much of what he's saying, but one thing I do know for sure. Whatever he's addressing, it's not Hashem. It's definitely not what we would call God. I immediately headed to the CCTV monitoring room and reviewed the camera footage of Mr. Wade's room. In the playback, Mr. Wade would sit still on his bed, staring blankly at the corner of the room. After 3 hours, he would suddenly get up, walk towards the corner and kneel. I turned on the audio and it was some kind of ritual. As he was chanting, his body would begin to sway, forward and backward. He would fold his hands and then raise them, palms forward. It was difficult to hear with all the white noise, but I could make out a quiet whispering. I strained to hear. Over time, whispers became more emphatic, more feverish, but it wasn't English. The words sounded harsh with uvular consonants. Almost immediately, I picked up the phone and called Frank. No, as far as I know, he only speaks English. On the camera in real time, Mr. Wade suddenly stopped, stood up and stepped back, and turned his head up to the ceiling. What happened next, I cannot explain empirically to this day. I'll call you back, Frank. Something's happening with Wade. I ran down the hallway through the hospital to get to the wing where Mr. Wade was located. When I arrived, the guard quickly waved me over to the window on the door. There he was, just as I saw him on the camera. How I perceived the scene was this. Mr. Wade appeared to be floating, his feet 6 inches above the ground, his head tilted upwards. I nudged the guard. Are you seeing that? The guard nodded. I knocked on the door. Mr. Wade, what are you doing? But he did not answer. His eyes remained closed and his head tilted back. I looked at the guard. Open this door immediately. I can't, Dr. Shudo. We weren't expecting you this late, so I left my key with my partner who's on a smoke break right now. I need to get into the room, do you understand me? The guard lifted his walkie-talkie and messaged his partner. 1033, requesting immediate assistance to room 31A, Block B, 1033. Mike, get your butt over here. Hey, I said to the guard. Something's happening. Mr. Wade, still floating, abruptly lifted his head and began to shout as though in a trance. I have done everything you required. I have served you loyally. Please, let me see you. Let me understand all. Let me behold your splendor. Coincidentally, at that precise moment we felt an earthquake. The lights began to flicker. Mr. Wade's body began to shake and his eyes rolled back. His face grimaced and then turned into a smile. I see them. Mr. Wade began to laugh maniacally, raising his voice to a feverish pitch. The room continued to shake violently. It's beautiful. I see them. I see the burning ones. The burning ones. At that moment, we heard Mr. Wade scream. The lights suddenly went out for a few seconds before the backup generator had started. When the lights turned back on, Mr. Wade was lying face down on the floor still. The room had a sickly sweet odor of burning metal, which we thought at first was due to the damage in the electrical wiring due to the earthquake. By then, the other guard was running down the hall. We unlocked the door and immediately rushed over to Mr. Wade's side to check on him. He was unresponsive, and when I checked for a pulse, I realized that he no longer had one. One of the guards phoned the paramedics, and I turned Mr. Wade's body around and then stepped back in horror. Where Mr. Wade's eyes should be, there were only remains of charred tissue. Almost nothing was left. I touched his hollow eye socket and instantly recoiled as if it was still burning hot. There wasn't any blood. His eyes had combusted so spontaneously that all the blood had evidently evaporated instantly. That was the metallic odor that we had noticed. I could hear one of the guards begin to vomit outside. "Dr. Shoto," Mike, the second guard, had asked. He was a large, muscular man, but he was trembling like a leaf. "What the heck could have done this?" "I don't know." I need to note a particularly disturbing phenomenon that the reports revealed several months after. The autopsy revealed that Mr. Wade's optical lobe, particularly in the area of the primary visual cortex, hadn't simply been inflamed. It had practically dissolved. Another case where an entire lobe simply dissolved to this extent has never been recorded. Later that evening, we were all called into an emergency research faculty meeting. I immediately began to brief the team on the fate of Mr. Wade, how his eyes had apparently spontaneously combusted at such high heat. I stated that considering the severe side effects Mr. Wade was experiencing in the weeks that led to his death, it would be in no way ethical for us to possibly continue the Omphernal study. I made the case that the drug was too dangerous for the safety of the patients in the study, and that we needed to halt all trials immediately. Dr. Franklin, the chief of the investigation, paused and took off his glasses. "Dr. Shoto, we concluded Mr. Wade's treatment 3 months ago, so we can tell you that this now, since it wouldn't affect the double-blind nature of this experiment. When we assigned the patients to the treatment groups, Mr. Wade was put in the control group for the entire duration of the treatment. We decided to allow you to continue psychiatric evaluation of the patient without telling you so that you could better detail his mental condition without bias." "He was given the placebo the entire time?" I asked, hearing my heart pounding. "Yes, Mr. Wade wasn't on Omphernal when the incident occurred. He never was." When I returned home after 1 in the morning, I couldn't sleep, so I decided to do some late-night filing work. There were stacks of MRI brain scans of these study participants. One caught my eye. You see, normally in patients with schizophrenia, we would see a smaller brain volume and reduction in cortical volume and thickness, most noticeably in the frontal and temporal lobes. And most notably, we would see atrophy in the hippocampus and thalamus. We noticed these symptoms to varying degrees in all patients in the study. However, this particular brain scan showed a perfectly healthy brain. No shrinkage, no atrophy, no visible markings of pathology at all. No schizophrenia or any other identifiable mental illness for that matter. This brain was the only one in that pile that didn't exhibit those telltale signs of a patient with schizophrenia, so I assumed it was a clerical error on the part of the intern. I then glanced at the name of the patient on the scan. Wade John. I sent in my resignation letter to NeuroCorp the following day.